On a field in the Swiss Alps, thousands of Catholics gathered around a tent. Inside that tent was an altar, and in front of that altar, 4 men knelt, while the ancient rite moved toward the moment Rome had warned against. A bishop placed his hands on each of their heads, one by one, and the Society of St. Pius X consecrated 4 new bishops without the permission of Pope Leo XIV. It happened despite the Pope's personal letter, despite canonical warnings, and despite decades of negotiations that had left the deepest questions unresolved. The morning began under bright skies over Icone. By the time the ceremony reached communion, the sky had turned gray, and rain had started to fall. For those gathered there, it was a day of joy, continuity, and tradition. For Rome, it was the return of a wound that had never fully healed, because this was not only the consecration of 4 men, it was a direct test of papal authority, episcopal communion, and the question that has followed the Society of St. Pius X since 1988. When a group says it must disobey Rome to preserve the faith, who has the authority to decide whether that act is fidelity or rupture? The consecration did not take place in a cathedral, and it did not take place under a papal mandate. It took place in Icone, Switzerland, the symbolic heart of the Society of St. Pius X, where thousands of faithful stood around a temporary altar set beneath a tent. The ceremony moved with solemn order, not confusion or surprise. Everyone involved knew what Rome had already said, and everyone knew the meaning of the act before the hands were placed on the heads of the men kneeling before the altar. The 4 priests were Pascal Schreiber of Switzerland, Michael Goldade of the United States, Michel Pouguin de la Maisonneuve of France, and Marco Nanipieri of France. Bishop Alfonso de Galarreta, one of the surviving bishops consecrated in 1988, served as the principal consecrator. Bishop Bernard Fellet, the former superior general of the society, stood with him as co-consecrator. The details mattered because this was not a private internal ceremony. It was a public act, performed by men whose own history was tied directly to the earlier rupture Rome had spent decades trying to repair. When the rite reached the laying on of hands, the warning became an accomplished fact. Rome had said this would be canonically identical to the consecrations of 1988, when Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops without papal approval. The Society of St. Pius X knew that judgment and proceeded anyway. By the time the 4 men rose as bishops, the visible ceremony had ended, but the invisible consequence had already begun. To understand why this moment carried so much weight, the Church had to look back to the beginning of the society itself. The Society of St. Pius X was founded in 1970 by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a French missionary bishop who rejected the liturgical and doctrinal reforms that followed the Second Vatican Council. The conflict was not only about the old liturgy, it was about religious liberty, ecumenism, the authority of Vatican II, and whether a Catholic society could claim to defend tradition while resisting the direction of Rome. That conflict reached its decisive point in 1988. After years of pressure and failed negotiations, Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops without a papal mandate. Pope John Paul II called it a schismatic act, and automatic excommunications followed under church law. Rome then spent the next 2 decades trying to bring the society back, not by pretending the act had been acceptable, but by searching for a path that could restore communion without denying the seriousness of the rupture. Pope Benedict XVI lifted the excommunications of the surviving 1988 bishops in 2009. That gesture was an act of mercy and an attempt to open a door, not a vindication of what Lefebvre had done. Negotiations continued under Pope Francis and then under Pope Leo XIV. But the underlying doctrinal disputes were never resolved. The questions that had divided the society from Rome remained in place, and this new ceremony showed that the old crisis had not disappeared. It had only waited for the next moment when bishops were needed. Through all those years, the Society of St. Pius X continued to ordain priests, but not bishops. That distinction became more urgent as the bishops from the 1988 generation grew older. Without new bishops, the society could not secure its seminaries, priestly ordinations, and global apostolate for the next generation. This was the reason the society gave for acting now. It said the consecrations were necessary to preserve the faith and continue its mission. Rome rejected that argument before the ceremony took place. The Vatican warned that consecrating bishops without a papal mandate would repeat the canonical gravity of 1988. The society could describe the act as necessity, but Rome viewed it as an illicit episcopal consecration and a direct wound to hierarchical communion. That was the line drawn before July 1st, 2026. The society crossed that line in the open. It did not act after a misunderstanding. And it did not act because Rome had failed to speak. The warnings had been issued, the historical precedent was clear, and the canonical consequence had been named before the rite began. That is why the ceremony at Econi was not only about succession inside the Society of St. Pius X. It was the moment an unresolved conflict became visible again before the whole Church. On June 29th, the Feast of Saints, Peter and Paul, Pope Leo XIV made one final appeal. The date was deliberate. It was the Feast of the Apostles of Unity, the day the Church remembers the two pillars whose witness stands at the foundation of Rome. Pope Leo wrote personally to Father Davide Pagliarani, the Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X, and the letter was not framed as a legal order. It was a direct appeal from the Pope to a society that was about to repeat the act that had defined its break with Rome. The Pope did not begin by denying the society's virtues. He acknowledged its love for liturgical life, its commitment to priestly formation, and its apostolic zeal. Those words mattered because Rome was not saying the Society of St. Pius X had no devotion, no discipline, or no Catholic instinct. The warning was more serious than that. Pope Leo was saying that these real goods could not justify an act that would wound communion with the Church. His strongest concern was for the faithful themselves. The Pope warned that thousands of ordinary Catholics attached to Society of St. Pius X chapels could be placed in a more difficult and painful situation regarding the lawful reception of the sacraments they loved. He invoked the seamless tunic of Christ, the garment left untorn at the foot of the cross. To tear that garment, he warned, was a matter of extreme gravity. He closed by keeping the door to dialogue open and entrusting the situation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. On June 30th, Father Pagliarani answered. His reply was respectful, warm, and filial in tone. He thanked Pope Leo for his paternal concern and spoke as a son addressing a father. He also noted that he had long hoped for a personal meeting with the Holy Father, a meeting that had never been arranged. The tone was careful, but the practical answer was already becoming clear. Pagliarani gave two main reasons for proceeding. First, he returned to 1988 and argued that the society had already been accused of schism in circumstances similar to the present moment, yet Rome was still speaking with it decades later. To him, that showed the society had never truly become schismatic in the way its critics claimed. Second, he cited bishops who had engaged in dialogue with the society and, in his account, recognized its Catholic spirit. These arguments were meant to show that the Society of St. Pius X was not acting as an enemy of the Church. Then he turned the Pope's own image back toward Rome. Pope Leo had warned against tearing the seamless tunic of Christ, but Pagliarani answered that the society believed it was trying to mend that tunic. In his view, the real tear had come from forces inside the Church that were incompatible with a truly Catholic spirit. The reply contained respect, gratitude, argument, prayer, and a request for the Pope's blessing. It did not contain a promise to postpone or cancel the consecrations. That reversal revealed the depth of the crisis. Rome and the Society of St. Pius X were not only disputing a date, a permission, or a disciplinary warning. They were arguing over where the wound in the Church actually was. Pope Leo saw the wound in an act carried out against papal authority. The society saw the wound in the post-conciliar direction of Rome itself. That is why the letters could not stop what happened at Econ. Both sides were using Catholic language, both spoke of fidelity, and both invoked the unity of the Church. But they no longer agreed on what obedience required when doctrine, tradition, and authority collided. Once the seamless tunic became the shared image and the disputed object, the ceremony was no longer only a question of law. It became a public claim about who was preserving the Church and who was tearing it. Before the consecrations began, a solemn declaration was read aloud to the faithful gathered at Econi. This was not a decorative introduction to the rite. It was the Society of St. Pius X's formal explanation for what it was about to do. The declaration opened by invoking the Catholic and Roman Church, faithful to the holy traditions received from the apostles. The framing was deliberate, because the society was not presenting itself as a movement against Rome, but as a body acting in defense of what it believed Rome itself should defend. The declaration then moved into accusation. It claimed that church authorities from Vatican II onward had been animated by a spirit contrary to the faith and could no longer bear sound doctrine. That language changed the weight of the ceremony. The society was not merely saying it needed bishops for practical continuity. It was saying that the crisis inside the Church had become so grave that the normal structures of authority could no longer be trusted to protect tradition. Then came the canonical core of the declaration. The society claimed a sacred duty before God, before the Holy Church, and before souls to proceed with the consecrations. It argued that the faith had to be preserved and that souls throughout the world needed the bread of life. That phrase turned the act from disobedience into obligation in the society's own logic. They were not saying they had received permission. They were saying the need was so serious that they could not wait for it. The declaration also rejected the force of any penalties in advance. It stated that all penalties and censures that might be imposed against the act would have no validity. That was the sentence with immediate legal significance. The Society of St. Pius X was not denying that church law existed. It was claiming that a state of necessity made the threatened punishment unable to bind. At the center of that argument stood the state of necessity. The society claimed that the crisis in the Church required action for the preservation of the faith and the salvation of souls. From its perspective, the consecrations were not a preference, a protest, or a display of independence. They were a duty, forced by circumstances. Without bishops, the society believed its seminaries, priestly ordinations, and apostolic work would eventually be placed in danger. Rome's answer to that logic was clear. Canon law can recognize grave necessity in certain situations, but the judgment of that necessity cannot simply be declared by the person or group carrying out the forbidden act. The Church had already examined this argument after 1988 and rejected it. The excommunications from that earlier rupture stood for 21 years. That history mattered because the society was now relying on the same defense for a new consecration. The deeper disagreement was not only over one canon, it was over who has the authority to determine whether a state of necessity exists. The Society of St. Pius X said the emergency was visible and demanded action. Rome said the Church alone had the authority to judge that claim in a way that binds the Church. That disagreement was at the heart of the whole crisis. Once it was spoken aloud before the rite, the ceremony at Econ carried both sacramental weight and institutional defiance. Father Pagliarani's homily made the society's self-understanding even clearer. He did not speak like a man apologizing for what was taking place. He spoke with joy, because for those gathered there, the day had finally arrived. The consecrations were presented not as a choice, not as a preference, and not as a question of liturgical taste. They were presented as a manifestation of faith. For Pagliarani, the faith could not be modified, reinterpreted, reconsidered, or adjusted to suit the language of the age. The society had one duty: to keep the faith the Church had always taught. He rejected the idea that the Society of St. Pius X was choosing faith over the Church. In his view, one belongs to the Church through the integral Catholic faith, complete and undiluted. This was the center of the Society's claim, and it explained why its faithful did not experience the ceremony as rebellion. But from the Catholic perspective of Rome, that claim was not enough. Belonging to the Church is not reduced to doctrinal conviction alone. It also includes sacramental communion and hierarchical communion. That is where the two sides continued to collide. The Society of St. Pius X insisted that it was preserving the faith of the Church. Rome saw a society acting without the visible communion that Catholic bishops are meant to embody. Pagliarani then named the gulf between the Society and Rome in language. He said the Society spoke the language of faith and tradition, while Rome now spoke of inclusion, listening, dialogue, and accompaniment. He did not reject listening entirely, but he insisted that it must always lead toward conversion. Then he turned to the 4 new bishops and gave them a charge. They were to be lambs before the will of God, but lions before the spirit of the world. After the ceremony, the question moved from the field at Icone back to the law of the Church. The canonical position was clear. Under Church law, a bishop who consecrates another bishop without a papal mandate, and the man who receives that consecration incurs automatic excommunication. The Society of St. Pius X had already declared those penalties invalid, but Rome does not accept that a group can dismiss the penalty attached to its own act. From the Vatican's view, the consequence was not erased by the Society's declaration. For the faithful attached to Society of St. Pius X chapels, the situation remained complex. The Society's masses had long been regarded as valid but illicit. Confessions heard by its priests had received special faculties from Pope Francis, while marriages remained more complicated. The consecrations did not change every Sunday morning overnight. The chapels would still open, the old rite would still be offered, and the faithful would still come. But the rupture behind those chapels had become harder to resolve. There was still a road back. Because history had shown that Rome could lift penalties and continue dialogue even after a serious rupture. But the road was now narrower. The unresolved issues were not only disciplinary but doctrinal: religious liberty, ecumenism, Vatican II, and the authority of the living Church remained the wall that goodwill alone could not remove. What happened at Icone did not close the old argument. It gave it new bishops. The morning had begun in bright sunshine over the Swiss Alps, with thousands gathered in a field around a tent. By the time communion came, the sky had darkened. The clouds had moved in, and rain had started to fall. For the Society of St. Pius X, it was a day of joy and continuity. For Rome, it was a wound in the visible unity of the Church. The same image remained between them: the seamless tunic of Christ. Pope Leo said the Society was tearing it. Pagliarani said the Society was trying to mend it. Someone is wrong about that, and the answer matters far beyond Icone. It matters for the 4 new bishops, for every priest they may ordain, and for every soul who will one day receive ministry from their hands. The Church now waits, prays, and watches what comes next.